It's a Bold Republic radio show, and you're listening to a Thursday edition of it. Usually on Thursdays, we head on out and talk to Wyoming Liberty Group, where if I've done this properly, Amy Edmonds from Wyoming Liberty Group is standing by. Are you there?
I am.
Oh, good. Okay. And voice is sounding great over Skype, too. So, well, the trick is just the way the board is set up right now. We have to connect, but I can't say, hello, are you there? I have to wait until we're actually on the air and do it. You've been working hard, Amy, on education in the state of Wyoming. And for those people who aren't in Wyoming, I want you to understand that what she's about to tell you relates to your state, too. Amy, I'm from Florida originally, where we did get school choice. And school budget problems were, for the most part, brought down and under control because we had an exploding population. When I moved there as a kid, there were 4 million people in Florida. Now there's 16 million people. So they had a problem, and of course it got out of control. But a state like Wyoming has a much smaller population. So do the Dakotas and Montana. And yet we still face the same budgetary problems and the same choice problems. So you've been writing about this, and you're about to give us an update. What's the latest on school choice?
Well, the latest is some interesting things have come out of the joint interim appropriations meetings that they've been holding throughout this spring and summer. In the one that they held in June, the lawmakers were actually briefed about where we are with the spending accounts for public education. Those accounts, Glenn, historically have always pretty much stayed on track with education spending, which is always consistently going up. So we are always spending more by each biennium on public education. However, this June, what lawmakers were told is that given the current spending projections, so knowing how much they're spending and they've already appropriated, we're looking at about a $270 million shortfall in the education spending account and about a $300 million shortfall in the capital construction spending account for the 2017-18 budget cycle.
Okay, now when you're dealing with a shortfall of that much, I was under the impression, first off, that the state of Wyoming, of course, had to balance its budget. But is there any law that makes them balance an education budget?
Yes, the budget will have to be, when they go into session this coming February in 2016, they will have to balance the budget. What this is telling lawmakers essentially is, listen, those accounts sit there and receive revenue over the course of the time when the legislature is not in session. And so the Legislative Service Office does these predictions where they look at revenues coming in, they look at predictable spending, they know what we're going to spend basically on education, and they say, okay, you've got some shortfalls. If everything stays the way they're going with what's coming in, with everything that's happening in the minerals industry in the state of Wyoming, we're looking at shortfalls. That pertains mainly to the education spending account, Glenn. The capital construction spending account, we can talk about actual appropriations in some instances because the legislature does appropriate out the building of schools far into the future, where they actually say, here's money. And in that case, they may well be looking at shortfalls of money that they've already passed in a bill saying we're going to spend it. They'll have to either go back and say we're not going to spend it, or more than likely what they're going to do is go into the general fund to make up for these shortfalls.
Okay, let's be clear so people don't necessarily panic over when when we take a look at Wyoming schools and they say, you guys are going to have a bit of a shortfall here, there's a problem. Exactly where does the shortfall come from? Because I am used to living in places where if there's a shortfall, it's because somebody was not smart with the money. Is it that, or is it just because we're going through a bit of a slowdown?
Slowdown. It's a revenue projection. We're having a slowdown. We're seeing a decrease in the minerals industry production, which affects both, sales and use tax as well as actual taxes coming off of those minerals that are being severed from the ground. So it's a combination of reasons why those education spending accounts are decreasing below, are getting into the red instead of being in the black. And then, of course, in general, education spending is always rising, Glenn. We consistently spend more on education each biennium.
Okay, but not to be too critical of these guys here, but Wyoming goes through a boom and bust. It just does. It always has. So why not be ready for when the next bust happens? In other words, have some kind of a rainy day fund set aside for our school systems for when this happens.
Well, the legislature does have quite a few coffee cans sitting there right now, and they have funds in them. So I have no doubt that they're going to be able to overcome. It sounds like a lot of money, and I'm sure for your listeners, 270 million in one and 300 million in another seems like a lot of money. Given the state of Wyoming spends like 1.3 billion dollars a biennium every 2 years on public education, that shortfall is not humongous, obviously. But the legislature will make up the shortfall. I think the question of how they're going to look at the future of education spending is a very important question, because it really gets to the heart of what are we doing with government spending in Wyoming, and what's going to happen if we don't get that under control. So last month, actually, I think it was in August, or in July, the joint chairs of the Select Committee on School Facilities actually wrote a letter addressing these shortfall issues, where they asked the Management Council of the legislature, and these are the folks that sort of oversee all of the committees, they basically asked them to assign as a study topic for them this idea of how we're going to make up for the shortfall. And what they said was they want the study topic of possible revenue generating mechanisms to fully fund the school foundation account. Let me translate that for you, Glenn. That means tax increases.
Yeah, as soon as you said, revenue generating or investments in, there's a whole pile of code words that they have here. So, okay, if tax increases in what?
That's the big question. It will be very interesting to see where the legislature goes. The reality is, and this was sort of the point that I made in my blog, I just wrote a blog on this. Really, it's pretty simple. If we continue with the kind of education spending, and really, Glenn, I can broaden this for the listeners. If we continue with this kind of spending in all facets of government, if we continue to spend and grow government, really there is not enough taxes to levy in the state of Wyoming to cover the costs. That's just the reality. We are such a low population state. They just really couldn't levy enough. And I don't think that they're going to continue to turn to the minerals industry, as you all well understand that up in Gillette. There is a downturn in many of these industries, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the minerals industry right now. It's going to be very difficult to try to turn to them and start increasing severance taxes.
Okay, so where do they go then? What do they do?
They start cutting spending in government is where they go.
Oh, come on. No, you can't do that, Amy. Let's be realistic here. I mean, you're asking for cutting. So, okay, cutting. Actually, I'm in favor of that. Cutting where, though? Because right away I think of cutting places other than schools. But is there waste in the school system?
Absolutely. So, and the point that I make in my blog is that Wyoming legislators need to be looking seriously at school choice initiatives and looking at other states. And you mentioned that you're from Florida. There's a great example. Florida has seen through scholarship programs, they have seen real, actual spending cuts, real decreases. So in the state of Florida, who initiated a tax credit scholarship, corporate tax credit scholarship, so corporations in the state of Florida were able to, decrease their tax burden to the state and instead give it to a tax credit scholarship organization. That program alone showed a taxpayer savings of $1.49 in education funding for every dollar that they lost in the corporate income tax revenue. So that's a significant difference. $1.49 for every dollar. That's a savings. And why? I'm always perplexed why the Wyoming legislature has been so resistant to looking at real choice initiatives, because what we see in choice in education are real savings. Wyoming spends $16,000, something like that, per child. We look at other states that have more choice mechanisms in their state, and they're spending half that amount of money.
I came across a story. I probably should have sent this to you. I came across a story where New York City is spending almost $22,000 a child per year and getting horrible results. But then you take a look at a state like Utah, and Utah isn't spending anywhere near that. It's like a little over $6,000 per student per year, but they're getting much better results by far than New York is. So apparently increasing the amount of money. Oh, by the way, most of that money that New York is spending went to an increase in their pensions and their health care rather than into the classrooms and to the students as well. So that's why I brought up at the very beginning, voucher system. Is that a good way for Wyoming to go? What do we do here? Maybe just look toward charter schools?
Listen, I think there are so many options for us to look at, Glenn, and the state should be looking at all of them. There's a myriad of different options from opportunity scholarships or vouchers, tax credit, deregulating the private school industry so that we can see more and more private schools opening up. The bottom line is giving parents more choice is going to be a relief for taxpayers in the state of Wyoming. That's just the reality. Other states have seen it. It's the reality of what happens. But what it requires is the political will and leadership to do it. And that's difficult because public education is a big business. It's a lot of money, and folks in that industry don't want to give up their dollars.
Okay. So I also, here I'm going to play devil's advocate. I've already asked some people who are homeschooling and charter school people in the state of Wyoming, but it's always worth asking, I think. But Wyoming is such a big state landmass wise, and there's so few people spread out over such a large distance. Do we have the infrastructure of charter schools, private schools, and homeschools available that can actually take up the slack?
As the saying goes, Glenn, if you build it, they will come. I think the reality for other states has been that when you see these kinds of education policy initiatives actually being made into law, do I think it'll happen overnight? No. But will it happen? Absolutely. You can look into your community, and if suddenly there was a tax credit scholarship or an opportunity scholarship or an education savings account, whatever mechanism the state might choose, where the folks in your community could suddenly take that $8,000 and educate their child, I can guarantee you probably have 4 or 5 churches in your community right now that would begin the process of opening up private schools and would probably do it in less than 6 months' time and start working on recruiting teachers and building curriculum and, putting little kiddos in school uniforms and offering a private school. Because when it's there, the market reacts. And when that money sits there and parents are holding the check saying, I've got $8,000, where shall I educate my child? They will have alternatives.
Okay. Well, one of the answers that I see when I look at this, and I'll have to give credit to New York. I hate to do this, Amy. Got to give credit where credit's due. New York City did do one thing right. They have their charter schools and some private schools located on and in public school property. So a kid might show up at the public school building, but may end up going down the hallway to a charter or a private school.
Yes. So, of course, charter schools are part of the public school system, and they have, in many states, they have the right to use public school facilities that aren't being used by, the district for a school or for other things. That absolutely works. And, at the end of the day, this is all taxpayer dollars going to educate children. So I think it is very clever and very efficient for states like New York to use those infrastructure things that they have for all of the different varieties.
And back with me is Amy Edmonds from Wyoming Liberty Group as we continue to talk about public schools, specifically in this case in the state of Wyoming. And I got to ask, Amy, how I always ask you this whenever we get on this topic. So as you talk to the state legislators and other important people out there, how receptive are they to giving some control over to public schools, private schools, and the voucher system? And I'm asking about the elected officials here.
I think it's a mixed variety. You've got some folks that just fundamentally very much support school choice, and they recognize the value and the authority of parents. The parents should have choices. Then you have probably a group of legislators who are skeptical. I think they're concerned with how it's going to work, if it will work well in Wyoming. And then you have the block of folks who are just completely, systematically, ideologically opposed to choice. They're strong supporters of the public school system, teachers' unions. They don't want the control of education out of the state's hands, and they certainly don't want parents to have choice.
See, I would think in a state like Wyoming, there'd be very few of those people in that last group.
There's probably more than you would imagine, Glenn.
I didn't want you to say that. You know that.
I know you didn't, but I had to.
Okay. Now let's get away to the bureaucracy then, because that's the fourth branch of government that people are just starting to acknowledge is the fourth branch of government. Where do they come down on school choice?
Typically not terribly in favor. I think there's a lot of uncertainty and concern amongst folks in the bureaucracy, particularly in public education, again, that their job might be rendered unnecessary and that they may not be needed if suddenly we have a lot of choice and variety happening in the education arena. So it's, there's some, and particularly those who really understand and have done their homework and research and know how powerful school choice can be. And also outcomes, what it means for outcomes. In my blog that I just wrote, talking about just the financial aspects, these shortfalls, I refer back to a piece I wrote earlier in the spring, just showing what we know to be true about outcomes in school choice. There's a variety of different reports where we've evaluated, a voucher program. So in Washington, D.C., we looked at graduation rates, and they're as high as 91%. In comparison to, they're like 30% higher than the graduation rates of regular DC public schools. So kids in Washington, D.C. who used to attend the voucher program were graduating at a 30% higher rate than those kids in the inner city in public schools. I could go on and on. There's markers. You can read the blog for yourself. There's lots of research out there that shows that we see greater outcomes in school choice. So people in bureaucracy who take the time and who really care about kids and want to know what works and what works well, they'll support public education.
Yeah, well, I mean, when it comes down to do I care about the kid or do I care about my job and my pension, you know which way, I hate to say it, but you know which way they usually fall. So who do you talk to if you're someone who's in favor of a voucher system in the state of Wyoming? Who do you go to?
If you're a parent and you're listening and you want to know who to talk to, you need to go, take your local state legislator out for coffee and have a conversation with them about school choice and about the kind of choice that you'd like to see in your community. It certainly does not hurt to also spend some time getting to know your local school board and talking to your school board members about what you as a parent want and what you want to see in your district and what kind of choice. Because there's a variety of different kinds of choice out there. There's, the big stuff that you and I are talking about, but there's choice as small as, I would really like to not be a zip code school district. In other words, in Gillette, I'm positive that the children go to the school based on what home they live in, where the address of their home is. Casper and Trona County is the only school district in the state that actually doesn't have that. It's a great little bit of choice. It's an oasis of choice in the public school system, in that parents in Casper can go take a look at all the different elementary schools and say, I don't want to go to the school that's closest to me or the one that I'm assigned to because this is my street address. I want to go to that school over there because I've heard it's got a great program or a great teacher or whatever. So talk to your local school board member. There's a lot of choice that you can try to get.
Okay, gotta run. Find Amy Edmonds at ylib.org. Thanks for coming on, Amy, as always. I appreciate it.